And no matter what Reading Rainbow taught you as a kid, reading books in this game is a surefire way to make you stupid. Normally when you think about old games built upon the Dungeons & Dragons license, your mind might wander onto titles such as Pool of Radiance, the first such game to properly translate a massive chunk of the D&D mechanics into a digital format, or Eye of the Beholder, which was able to add real-time elements to the mix by utilizing mechanics first pioneered by an earlier game known as Dungeon Master, or even the original Neverwinter Nights, which was being played online through AOL before the beginnings of the World Wide Web had even gone public. One thing's for certain though, no matter which D&D game you think of, there's a party involved. Or rather, there are always multiple characters taking part in the quest with a variety of skills at their disposal to ensure each obstacle encountered can be overcome in some manner or another. However, today's ancient DOS game is Dungeon Hack, a game based on D&D where you take on the adventure solo. Now, it wasn't uncommon for early dungeon crawls to be single-character affairs. In fact, it was quite common. But those games were almost always tailored to have their mechanics and functionality work throughout the course of the game, regardless of how your character had been created. Essentially, the mechanics were built to suit the design and progression of the game. Dungeon Hack is instead a game where the design and progression needed to be built around pre-existing mechanics, and more specifically, the AD&D Second Edition rule set. And that in and of itself wouldn't be such a big deal if those mechanics were designed around the concept of a solo adventure. But since they're not, it ended up leading to a game with some curious design choices to ensure that any character you create has at least some potential to finish a dungeon, but the reality is certain classes are just going to fare better than others despite those tweaks and additions. In fact, the vibe I get from this game is that the developers saw what was going on with randomly generated dungeon crawls and wondered if they could take an engine they already had established with all of its mechanics intact and apply random dungeon generation to that existing interface to end up with a full and complete game in an extremely short development cycle. And the irony is that what we've ended up with here is perhaps the most shallow, story-deprived D&D game ever created, which plays surprisingly well, except it's almost too random, as in your success or failure often has nothing to do with your own skill at the game and everything to do with what the RNG decided to put you up against. To that end, I've never actually cleared a run of this game, and as such won't be able to demonstrate the entire breadth of what the game is able to offer up, but that's not to say you can't clear it, just that you'd better know what you're getting yourself into before you try. Dungeon Hack was originally developed by DreamForge Intertainment, previously known as Event Horizon Software not long prior, being published by SSI in 1993, and is a one-player first-person dungeon crawl. It supports VGA 320x200, 256 color graphics, and a slightly odd selection of audio devices, supporting only AdLib, the MPU 401, Roland devices, and the PC speaker for music, while only supporting the Sound Blaster and MediaVision Thunderboard for sound effects. As for its current release date, the game is still commercial and is readily available as part of the Forgotten Realms Archive Collection 3 on both GOG and Steam, which comes with both this game and another D&D title, Menzoberranzan, for $6. As for physical copies, you generally don't find many at a time, but the prices tend to be fair, around $10 to $15 for just the media, or $25 to $35 fully boxed. Not to mention, you tend to find it fully boxed in the first place, given the manual-based copy protection. Plus, the same archive collection for sale digitally was itself a physical product, and thus it too can be found for similar prices. And the only trick really is that there's both a floppy disk and CD-ROM release of the game, and while it's not hard to find loose CDs, finding a fully boxed CD-ROM release appears to be exceptionally difficult, as every boxed release I came across in my searches came with floppy disks. But I've seen a picture of the box which shows an added CD-ROM tag on it to indicate the type of media inside, so I at least know it exists. But if that's the specific physical copy you want, it may not be so easy to acquire.
Ancient orb, where rest you now?
Something I find incredibly ironic about this game is that it attempts to present a story of some sort prior to any gameplay beginning, but even what little story is here is paper thin. Basically, some magical being keeps going on about some orb and ends up sending a hero she's summoned off to some unknown dungeon to fetch it. Seriously, Doom has more of a story than this game, just kinda saying something. Anyways, the main meat of Dungeon Hack is in the dungeon crawl itself, which starts with the player creating their character. The character creation here in Dungeon Hack is very similar to how it's presented in a lot of SSI Dungeons & Dragons titles, whereby you choose your character options from various lists, and each time you select an option, certain other options gray out to indicate they aren't compatible with what you've chosen. There's also a button to reroll the character stats, or you can edit the stats however you want, which can technically be used to cheat, but is more so present so that you can either use your own rolling method outside of the game, or input the stats of a character that you created elsewhere. A few other things to note about the stats here. The first is that THAC0 is still a thing, as is the concept of armor class being better the lower it is. Again, AD&D Second Edition rules. Another thing is that charisma still needs to be rolled, which is kinda hilarious because, as far as I'm aware, it has virtually no use at all anywhere in this game. Even the manual, which goes into considerable detail with the other 5 stats to indicate what they're doing, just sort of glosses over charisma, saying it can help you become a paladin, which kinda doesn't matter because there's a button for that. The one last thing to mention is that the alignment choice may seem like it wouldn't actually affect anything, but remember the little joke I made right at the start of the video? It turns out you only get stupider from books if you read one which either doesn't apply to your chosen profession, or your alignment. Thus, whatever alignment you give yourself, make sure to factor that in when deciding to try reading a book in this game or not. Following character creation, you're able to choose the game's settings. Normally you have 3 options: easy, moderate, and hard. However, one of the big selling points of the game is having near total control over the dungeon generation process through a customization screen. From here, you can set up all kinds of different factors, dialing in which dungeon traits you don't mind dealing with, which you would rather not deal with, along with a number of other options which don't have a huge overall effect on things. For instance, the hints option refers to how often you find parchments, which give you hints as to how certain mechanics work, since not everything is explained in the manual. There's also an option, Character Death Real, which is simply a permadeath option, whereby if you die at any point in the game, all save files linked to that character get deleted. You're also able to save one batch of custom settings at a time, which you can restore on command. But if you want to keep a variety of possible settings on hand, you'll need to write down the generation seed listed at the bottom, which you can also edit by hand, and even manually define the random part in order to end up with a matching dungeon to a prior run, or roll the dice on some other number you come up with yourself. Now, once you get into the actual gameplay, it's going to feel very familiar if you've already played Eye of the Beholder, as it's essentially the same engine. But here, it's been streamlined a little, given the focus on playing as just a single party member. Well, your inventory is entirely slot-based, whereby you have 3 pages of 18 slots to hold items, so a total of 54 slots. You use items by placing them in your primary or secondary hand, and then pressing the appropriate button beside your character portrait, with some items being usable by clicking on one to pick it up and dropping it on your character portrait directly. Plus, you can throw items by dropping them at or above the center of the 3D view, which can help in some very specific circumstances. In fact, maybe it's been streamlined a little too much. As you begin exploring, you're going to quickly realize there's a lot of set dressing you can right-click on to get some descriptive text, but none of it ever changes, and none of it is ever relevant to anything going on. Not to mention, if you're trying to find a hidden button to open a door, you don't have to click anywhere near the actual hidden button to activate it. It's just anywhere in the middle of the 3D view will suffice. These things aren't inherently bad, but helps to set some expectations as you go forward. One thing I didn't mention yet is that the game makes a big deal out of dual and triple classing being a possible way to get around the shortcomings of being by yourself on these adventures. But there's a couple catches. The first is that any experience points you get are split evenly between your multi-classes, thus slowing down your rate of advancement considerably. But also, some classes inherently hinder each other. For instance, I tried doing a fighter-mage combo at one point, which seemed like it'd be a decent option. Except you have to take your armor off to do any spell casting, and then put it back on the moment you want to engage in melee combat. It wouldn't be such a big deal if encounters happened like they do in a proper D&D session, where each encounter is basically an event which takes time and effort to get through. Here in Dungeon Hack, because everything is so streamlined, encounters happen constantly, and each one is often over before it begins, at least in the early game when monsters are still relatively weak. Still, because everything is happening on dice rolls with considerable variance, you can have a fight end in a single slash of your weapon, and then the next fight against the exact same kind of monster takes 5 or 6 attacks instead. Plus, because you're doing so much combat so frequently, you end up camping all the time, which feels ridiculous when you consider that, as any class other than a cleric, it can take several in-game days to restore your health, allowing fresh monsters to spawn that entire time. One trick to help avoid taking hits is to use lots of magic and ranged attacks. Though if you're using lots of magic, that's just more camping you have to do to get your spells back. And if you're using ranged attacks, you have to go pick up all of the ammo you used, or darts you threw, or whatever at the end of combat, all one at a time. Also, you better hope when you go to camp that there's no monsters nearby, but then at the same time, it's kinda handled in a non-realistic way in that so long as no enemies can reach you within just a few moves, you can camp as much as you want. Otherwise, you can't camp at all. Doing a lot of camping also burns through a lot of food, which is one of just many random items you'll come across, but usually when you come across an item, you don't get the whole story about it. For instance, a morning star may say it's just a morning star, but is it actually magical? Or worse, what if it's cursed? Or say you pick up a wand made of bamboo. Well, what does it do? And occasionally you can figure things out just by using them, such as with the wands, but sometimes you don't really have that option, or sometimes trying to use something may do more harm than good. Normally, to identify items in D&D on the fly, you need an identify spell, which you will start with if you have a mage class. But other than that, you can spend a huge chunk of your adventure not having a clue what some of your items do unless and until you find a scrying glass. And even then, it only works for a few uses and is itself a fairly uncommon thing to encounter. In fact, that's one of the key problems as to why it's so random whether you can survive an adventure or not, because it could simply be that nothing you have acquired will do the trick for the class you are. For instance, my paladin here was doing great until he got to the 3rd floor of this dungeon and started encountering were-rats. Now, were-rats here aren't normally all that threatening. They're fast, but weak and go down easy, with one tiny little catch. They are only vulnerable to silver weapons and magical attacks. Now, I'm playing as a paladin, so I don't have magical attacks, plus I didn't have any silver weapons. But none of my stuff is identified, so I started going through the weapons I found to see if any of them could hit the were-rats. None of them could hit the were-rats. Yeah, I started going through some of my wands and such instead, but that ultimately turned into a losing proposition, because, again, you fight a ton of battles per dungeon floor. Sure, a wand of fireballs would normally be a game changer in the proper tabletop experience, or even some of the other party-based D&D games made prior to this one. But here, it's just yet another magical attack which hits one enemy at a time with none of its area of effect properties. Well, sure, the manual says it damages everything in the target square, but there can only ever be, at most, 2 enemies in a target square, and only if they're small enemies. Large enemies don't ever double up, so the area of effect Fireball would normally have ends up being surprisingly worthless here. All that said, the game itself does recommend that you thoroughly explore every dungeon floor before moving on, which is especially important if you're playing with multi-floor keys, whereby a key found on one floor may not be used until a later floor, meaning it's possible the dungeon generated a magic weapon in a room that I simply missed on an earlier floor. But without frequent identification capabilities, how would I know that? Heck, I'd have to be playing as a mage to get access to the Identify spell, who intrinsically starts with magical attacks like Burning Hands and Magic Missile, so encountering were-rats as a mage without silver or magical weapons doesn't even matter. I will say, I do like that this game added an auto-map feature, but each dungeon floor literally fills out the entire dungeon map, so it can become relatively easy to know if and when you've fully explored a dungeon floor or not, just by looking at the map, since if there's any blank areas but no way into them, there must be a secret wall of some sort, either a secret button or a false wall that you can walk straight through, with these things often not being telegraphed in any way. You'd either need to use magic to detect them, or, without access to said magic, just blind guess based on where the blank area is located. As I've said before, when you have to start metagaming the mechanics of a game to make progress, you start losing immersion. The game also throws silver and gold coins everywhere, each of which takes up a slot in your inventory, each of which is used at special receptacles found throughout the dungeon to perform healing. Silver coins just do basic healing, while gold coins also cure diseases and get rid of poison. Also, the moment you find a grappling hook, make sure you pick it up and never get rid of it, as traps are a thing in this game, dealing with traps is not fun, and some traps send you spiraling down to the dungeon floor beneath, meaning to get back up without meeting an early demise, you're gonna need that grappling hook. All of that said, I have noted that because the random generation is as random as it is, you can end up getting exceptionally good items really early on. My Dwarven fighter here ended up getting a pair of gauntlets very early in his run, and upon wearing them, his strength stat shot up to an insane 22, which I didn't even realize proper D&D stats could get that high. It turns out I had found a pair of Gauntlets of Fire Giant Strength, arguably one of the best items in the game if you're going to be doing lots of melee combat. Unfortunately, said fighter got overwhelmed by a ridiculous number of Zill inhabiting the 5th floor of the dungeon, which I probably could have pushed through that with enough reloads, but I was having to do 100-hour campouts after every fight or two, spawning new Zill the entire time. I was essentially playing Whack-a-Zill. It's like Whack-a-Mole, except instead of harmless moles, it's big red demons who lay eggs in your stomach which burst out into brand new baby demons after 4 days. Don't think it's going to catch on in any amusement centers anytime soon. One last thing I should mention though is that because the game is strictly adhering to D&D rules as best as it can, the manual is chock full of useful information not presented in the game, including a full bestiary of every kind of opponent the game can pitch you up against, full item lists, though the manual doesn't actually tell you what those items do, a full spell listing and descriptions for both the cleric and mage spells, base weapon and armor stats, and even advancements charts. Like, seriously, even though the manual doesn't tell you everything, playing this game without it would be a really bad idea. Overall, I want to like Dungeon Hack because there's nothing really wrong with the raw gameplay itself. But even for me, someone who enjoys procedurally generated content in games, this is just too random even for my tastes. I've owned the game for a while now, and every once in a while I get it in my mind to go give it another try, and then I'm quickly reminded of why I don't keep playing it when I go back to it, as success almost always boils down to luck instead of skill. Not to mention, you are almost constantly engaged in combat, and there's not really any meaningful story or lore to keep things interesting. The game really does just feel like a shallow attempt to repurpose an existing game engine and mechanics to do something they weren't really intended to do. Which again, in and of itself, can work. And again, the game is entirely playable. You just have to be of the mindset that not every run through this game could be a winner. Now, if you're okay with that, and you enjoy dungeon crawls, then by all means, give this one a shot. But if you prefer your dungeon crawls to have meaningful lore and story progression, or to have at least some semblance of success via skill as opposed to success via luck, then this is not the game for you. Now, thankfully, all you have to do to get this game running its best in DOSBox is to just set cycles to max. Now, you can also opt for a moderate fixed amount like 20,000, and that'll do the trick too. Leaving cycles on auto technically works, but certain things end up more slow than they should be when you do it that way. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Sorry it's a week late, but things were kind of dumb in real life and I needed a break to get myself back on track appropriately. So, to help take out some of those lingering frustrations, the next game we're going to take a look at for episode 361, debuting 2 Saturdays from now on August 29th, will basically be an overhead twin-stick shooter. And no, it's not Smash TV. In fact, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but despite the massive number of ports of Smash TV from the arcades back in the 90s, I don't think DOS was ever one of them. Well, in any case, stay tuned to see one such similar game we ended up getting instead. Thanks for watching, and extra special thanks to everyone pledging support over on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you too can see yourself here and help keep the show going, so please consider joining over at patreon.com/KASICK.